I recently wrote an article called Nietzsche's Eternalist Return, and I'll link that in the description. And I just posted it, so I wanted to do some videos based on it. And this is going to be the first one in that series. Probably there might be 3 videos. And it's going to deal with the question of what Nietzsche actually thought about his idea of the eternal return or eternal recurrence. How seriously did he take it? Did he think it was just a useful kind of thought experiment to prompt us to live more fully? Or did he take it to be a serious scientific account of how the universe works? As I was preparing for my article, I looked into this question quite deeply. And a lot of it, most of it, in fact, didn't find its way into the final form. And that's because it's not the main issue of what the article is talking about. So I called the article Nietzsche's Eternalist Return because basically it's my understanding, my reinterpretation of Nietzsche's idea of the eternal return in a way that fits with modern physics, in particular the theory of relativity. And it fits with it, or at least the central idea of Nietzsche's eternal return, fits with modern physics really, really nicely. There's one big qualification to that, which is quantum theory, which I mentioned at the end of the article. But in terms of relativity, it fits wonderfully, because relativity tells us that actually everything in space and time exists equally. What we call the future and what we call the past equally exists. You could say eternally exists. And that's the philosophical idea of eternalism. So my thesis is basically that whilst modern physics renders a literal interpretation of Nietzsche's eternal return, which is that the whole cosmos recurs in exactly the same way an infinite amount of times, though modern physics renders that highly unlikely or impossible, it also gives us this other, and I would say better and purer way to understand Nietzsche's idea, which is through eternalism, through the theory of relativity. So I'm not going to get into all that stuff now, because that will come later, even though that's the main part of the article or the post that I wrote. But when I drafted it up, I actually spent a lot of time dealing with this question of what Nietzsche himself thought about his idea and whether he even meant it as a serious cosmological theory in the first place. And like I said, I cut out most of that because it's a little bit distracting in a way, and it can, in a sense, be summarized in a couple of paragraphs, which is what I ended up doing. But it may be an interesting question in its own right. I think it's an interesting question in its own right. And it's been debated by scholars for quite some time. So hopefully this might be of interest to some people. And this is just my research, my conclusion in regard to this question of, did Nietzsche believe in a literal eternal return? So that's how I've posed it, at least. A literal eternal return, like the cosmos will literally recur and return again exactly as it was an infinite number of times. So here's the article, and I'll read from the start, and then I'll kind of go off to my own notes about this question of what Nietzsche thought of the idea. But I'll start off with the start, partly to set the scene, partly because maybe there might be some viewers, I don't know, who aren't super familiar with the idea of the eternal return. So here goes. What if you lived exactly the same life you have lived eternally? How would you react to this? How would you live the rest of your life in light of it? This was the provocative challenge posed by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century, who asked us to imagine a universe that eventually repeats itself in every detail over and over again. He called this the eternal return. In his autobiography, Nietzsche recounts the momentous day the idea came to him. In the late summer of 1881, he was walking beside the beautiful Swiss alpine lake Silvaplana. He paused beside a huge pyramidal rock, and the idea first struck him. It would become the central idea of his poetic philosophical masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which he'd begin 2 years later. But he would first present it in the penultimate aphorism of his 1882 book, The Gay Science, under the title The Greatest Weight. And so this is a very famous passage, perhaps one of the most famous, most quoted passages of Nietzsche, of which there are many. And this is from the Kaufman translation. I'm pretty sure that's correct. Let me just double check that. Yes, this is from the Kaufman translation. So I'll read it out. What if someday or night a demon were to steal after you into your loneliest loneliness and say to you, this life as you now live it and have lived it, you will have to live once more and innumerable times more, and there will be nothing new in it, but every pain and every joy and every thought and sigh and everything unutterably small or great in your life will have to return to you, all in the same succession and sequence. Even the spider, and this moonlight between the trees, and even this moment, and I myself. The eternal hourglass of existence is turned upside down again and again, and you with it, speck of dust. Would you not throw yourself down and gnash your teeth and curse the demon who spoke thus? Or have you once experienced a tremendous moment when you would have answered him, you are a god, and never have I heard anything more divine? If this thought gained possession of you, it would change you as you are, or perhaps crush you. The question in each and every thing, do you desire this once more and innumerable times more, would lie upon your actions as the greatest weight. Or how well disposed would you have to become to yourself and to life to crave nothing more fervently than this ultimate eternal confirmation and seal. So along with his matchless style, you can hear in this just how transformational the idea was for him. For Nietzsche, eternal return was the ultimate triumph of immanent reality over a posited transcendence. As he suggests in Beyond Good and Evil, it was the fruit of his attempt to think pessimism through to its depths and to liberate it from the lingering religious sense that it's bad that God is dead and there's no salvation beyond this world. While powerful as a thought experiment, it's unclear how seriously Nietzsche took the idea as a theory of how the cosmos actually works. Though somewhat plausible in the physics of his day, later scientific developments effectively rule it out. And yet, in an ironic twist, modern science lends strong support to its central insight that everything is eternal, not through endless repetition, but by existing in four-dimensional space-time. And so this next part is where I talk about what Nietzsche thought of it. And I think that instead of reading this out, I'm going to now go to my notes and sort of go through in a very much more in-depth way. Because essentially in the article that I wrote, it's just these two paragraphs. Now, a couple of things that I also want to mention before we really get into it, which is just how important the idea was to Nietzsche. So this wasn't just a sort of throwaway idea that he came up with and sort of tossed out a few times in different works, but something that he really saw as being central to what he was doing. So for instance, on the last line of the last book he published, which was Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche defines himself as, quote, the teacher of the eternal return, end quote. And in his autobiography, which was Ecce Homo and was written in the same year, he calls the idea the highest formula of affirmation that is at all attainable, end quote. And then he goes on to talk about how the idea came to him on the banks of Lake Silvaplana, like we've talked about. So, just to start off, I'll just mention that it's striking that in all the works that he published, Nietzsche never directly argues for the literal truth of eternal return. So this is something that's been much noted by scholars before. But rather, when it appears, so this is in his published works, it generally takes the form of a hypothetical or is distanced by literary means from Nietzsche, the author. And we can see that in his first public presentation of it, which is what's on the screen right now, which is what we read just before, which is from The Gay Science. And this is, like I said, the penultimate aphorism of book 4 of The Gay Science. I think that a later book 5, was added to that, but that is aphorism 341 that we're looking at here. So in this presentation, what can we see? We can see that already it's framed as a hypothetical. What if a demon were to steal it after you and tell you all this? What then? That it's a demon further distances us from everyday reality. The demon makes no argument for the idea as well. He just states it as a fact. The point of the aphorism is how one would react to it and why. Earlier in the same book, Nietzsche does seem to assert it as a reality, though without argument and only in passing. Speaking of the universe, he says, quote, "The whole musical box repeats eternally its tune," unquote. And that's from aphorism 109. Now, Nietzsche considered eternal return the fundamental idea of Zarathustra. So he says that in Ecce Homo, in the part where he talks about how the idea came to him. He goes on to talk about it being the fundamental idea of Zarathustra. And so we might expect to find him clearly assert and argue for the idea in that work, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And at first glance, we seem to. But we immediately hit a problem. The very form of this work, a narrative account in highly poetic allegorical prose of the journeys and discourses of a fictional character, the very form militates against any straightforward interpretation of what is said in it. And there are further complications. So let's look at the apparent argument for the reality of eternal return in Zarathustra. So this occurs in the second chapter of part 3, titled Of the Vision and the Riddle. It occurs in a vision and is presented as a riddle. In the vision that Zarathustra recounts, he was walking up a mountain path with the spirit of gravity. So the spirit of gravity is a crippled hybrid of dwarf and mole. So he has the spirit of gravity on his back, and the spirit of gravity is taunting and mocking him. Finally, he summons his courage and challenges the dwarf to hear his abysmal thought. The dwarf, the spirit of gravity, jumps down, curious. Near them stands a gateway, and now proceeds the clearest argument for the eternal return in Nietzsche's published works. "Behold this gateway, dwarf," I went on. So this is Zarathustra talking. "It has two aspects. Two paths come together here. No one has ever reached their end. This long lane behind us, it goes on for an eternity, and that long lane ahead of us, that is another eternity. They are in opposition to one another, these paths. They abut on one another, and it is here at this gateway that they come together. The name of the gateway is written above it, Moment. But if one were to follow them further and even further, And further, do you think, dwarf, that these paths would be in eternal opposition? Everything straight lies, murmured the dwarf disdainfully. All truth is crooked. Time itself is a circle. Spirit of gravity, I said angrily, do not treat this too lightly, or I shall leave you squatting where you are, lame foot, and I have carried you high. Behold this moment, I went on. From this gateway moment a long eternal lane runs back, and eternity lies behind us. Must not all things that can have run, have already run, along this lane? Must not all things that can happen, have already happened, been done, run past? And if all things have been here before, what do you think of this moment, dwarf? Must not this gateway too have been here before? And are not all things bound fast together in such a way that this moment draws after it all future things, therefore draws itself too? For all things that can run must also run once again forward along this long lane. And this slow spider that creeps along in the moonlight, and this moonlight itself, and I and you at this gateway whispering together, whispering of eternal things, must we not all have been here before? And must we not return and run down that other lane out before us, down that long, terrible lane? Must we not return eternally? So that's the end of the quote. This argument seems to vanquish the spirit of gravity, who at this point disappears. In the infinite time, each side of the present moment, all possible things must have been and will be. And all things are so bound together through cause and effect that they must recur in exactly the same order. Each cycle brings about its own repetition. So this seems like a rational argument, but how seriously did Nietzsche intend it? Though uttered by his hero, it is within a vision, considered as a riddle. And it is for a specific purpose, to vanquish the spirit of gravity. And who is the spirit of gravity? In his magisterial commentary on Zarathustra, the scholar Lawrence Lampert identifies it with the spirit of Platonism, which elevates rationality above actual life. More specifically, he identifies the dwarf mole with a final shrunken form of Platonism, skeptical of the rationality of reality, yet devastated by the awareness that no ideal alternative exists, that the spirit of rational seriousness is defeated by the book's closest approach to a clear rational argument, is therefore appropriate, and suggests the one who wields it may not take it so seriously. Zarathustra culminates in Nietzsche's hero willing the eternal return, a feat that nearly destroys him. During his convalescence, his two animals, a snake and an eagle, speak with him. In this chapter, we find further assertions of the eternal return, however, not from the lips of Zarathustra, but from the mouths of his animals. So this is from part 3, chapter 13, titled The Convalescent. So they say, this is the animals speaking now, they say to Zarathustra, "Behold, we know what you teach, that all things recur eternally, and we ourselves with them, and that we have already existed an infinite number of times before, and all things with us. You teach that there is a great year of becoming, a colossus of a year. This year must, like an hourglass, turn itself over again and again, so that it may run down and run out anew, so that all these years resemble each other, resemble one another, in the greatest things and in the smallest, so that we ourselves resemble ourselves in each great year, in the greatest things and in the smallest." Zarathustra's responses to his animals are telling. He first speaks of the insufficiency of words. He says, for instance, quote, "Speech is a beautiful foolery. With it man dances over all things," end quote. And then twice he calls the animals, quote, "buffoons and barrel organs," end quote. He apparently does not even hear the most explicit description of the idea, which is the one we've just read, while he's lost in his own private musings. So the most literal assertion of the eternal return in Zarathustra is made by talking animals against subtly denigrating comments, and eventually complete inattention of its hero. It's unquestionable that Nietzsche intended his heroes willing the eternal return as the crucial event of the book, but that this involved the affirmation of a cosmological theory seems questionable by design. The idea makes a final appearance in part 4 of Zarathustra, which kind of sits outside the self-contained story of the rest of the book. Full of buffoonery, part 4 is the satire play after the tragic trilogy of the first 3 parts. Nietzsche only distributed it among a few select friends. He didn't publish it for the general public. In the culminating intoxicated song, Zarathustra puts the idea in the form of a conditional. So this is from Book 4, Chapter 19. Zarathustra says, "Did you ever say yes to one joy? Oh, my friends, then you said yes to all woe as well. All things are chained and entwined together. All things are in love. If ever you wanted one moment twice, if ever you said, you please me, happiness, instant, moment, then you wanted everything to return." Now, once again, the purpose of this passage is psychological, prompting one to a state of affirmation. And the metaphysical theory implied by it is only the causal interrelation of all events, not that they do return. In a later work, Beyond Good and Evil, eternal return appears, again, in the form of a psychological challenge. Aphorism 56 describes how one who has endeavored to think pessimism through to its depths may unexpectedly behold its opposite, which is described in this way. The ideal of the most high-spirited, alive, and world-affirming human being who has not only come to terms and learned to get along with whatever was and is, but who wants to have what was and is repeated into all eternity, shouting insatiably da capo, not only to himself, but to the whole play and spectacle. Direct references in the other published works are scarce. Now, I've already mentioned one, the final line of Twilight of the Idols, in which Nietzsche calls himself the teacher of the eternal return. But that is the only direct reference in the book, and the preceding passages barely even sketch the idea, focusing instead on the affirmation of life. Now, there are a few references in the autobiographical Ecce Homo, most notably how the idea first came to him, that it is the highest formula of affirmation, and that it is the fundamental idea behind Zarathustra, as we've seen. It's also praised under the name of amor fati, or love of fate. Quote, that man wishes nothing to be different, either in front of him or behind him or for all eternity, end quote. But aside from a passing suggestion that Heraclitus may have taught the doctrine, all these references deal with eternal return as a psychological orientation to life rather than a cosmological theory. So overall, the impression we get from reading Nietzsche's published works is that eternal return is important because it challenges us to affirm the whole of life and live in a way in which we can affirm it. Its literal truth is secondary or maybe irrelevant. But if we look at Nietzsche's private notebooks, we get a very different impression. Here he seems very concerned with eternal return as a cosmological theory and seems to really believe it. This is evident from the first notes he wrote on it through to the end of his productive life. In the very first note, penned in 1881 in Sils Maria, as he describes it in the note, 6,000 feet above the sea and far higher above all human things. In this note, it's described as a doctrine, and a reality is described as a doctrine, first of all, and secondly, as a reality beyond our control. So he says, quote, this piece of human history does and must repeat itself eternally, and a little later, we have no influence over it, end quote. Subsequent notes from that year make the cosmological dimension even more explicit. So he says, for instance, the amount of total energy is limited. However, time in which the totality exerts its energy is infinite. Up to this moment, an infinity has passed, i.e., all possible developments must already have come to pass. Consequently, the present development must be a repetition and also the one which bore it, and the one which will originate from it, and so on, forward and backward. Or in another note, he says, the external world of energies leads back to a simpler state of these energies, and also forward to a simpler state. Could not and must not both states be identical? Out of a system of fixed energies, i.e., out of a measurable energy, no enumerability of states can arise. Only in the case of the false presupposition of an infinite space, in which energies evaporate, as it were, is the last state an unproductive one, a dead one. If an equilibrium of energy had ever been reached, it would still exist. Thus, it never occurred. The present state contradicts such an assumption. So this is an interesting note because he's kind of wrestling with the second law of thermodynamics, which sort of says that entropy will increase over time. And the idea that had already, I think, occurred to people at that time, which was that the universe, therefore, might end in heat death. But then the universe at that time wasn't conceived to have a beginning like we conceive of it through the Big Bang. We'll talk more about that later, but basically what Nietzsche is saying here is that if time is infinite, then the universe had no beginning. And so if there was a sort of a heat death where everything sort of just shuts down and can no longer be productive, and it's just like a blank cosmos forever, if that could happen, it would have already happened. But if that can't happen for whatever reason, then, we know that it can't happen because it hasn't happened in infinite time. And so that's his kind of response to that. He's also talking here about space being necessarily finite, which is another, you could say, implicit premise of his argument, which we'll look at later. But anyway, this shows that he's sort of thinking through these things in a very scientific way. He's thinking about this as a cosmological theory, not just as a thought experiment, not just as a psychological challenge. And then also from his notebooks around this time, he says, my doctrine says, the task is to live in such a way that you must wish to live again. Sorry, there's a typo there. I should have included the two. My doctrine says the task is to live in such a way that you must wish to live again. You will anyway. And so that's significant because it's kind of combining both into the same sentence. It's combining the idea of the eternal return as a psychological challenge, as a thought experiment to think through, how would I live if this were the case? But then it's adding on to the end, you will anyway. You will live again anyway. Live this very same life again. And so it's interesting that they're both put in there. If it was just a thought experiment, you wouldn't expect to see him sort of have that little quip at the end. So as I mentioned, we can see here that Nietzsche's treating the idea with the utmost scientific seriousness. It doesn't seem that he dropped this approach to it. It doesn't seem like, for instance, he just, when he thought of the idea, he was treating it scientifically, and then later on he thought, okay, that won't work out, I'll just drop it and I'll just treat it as a thought experiment. There's a very late note. This is another famous note. There's a very late note written in the spring of 1888, less than a year before his final mental collapse on the 3rd of January 1989, in which he makes a clear and precise argument for the idea. And this was included as an aphorism, 1066, of the posthumous work The Will to Power, which was assembled from his notebooks. So The Will to Power is a controversial work because he didn't create it in a way, or at least he didn't create it as that structure or as that order. What it is a collection of notes that he had prepared in his notebooks that his sister, who was essentially looking after him and kind of in control of his literary estate, she kind of facilitated the gathering of these notes and put them into a certain structure and released that as a new book as The Will to Power. Nevertheless, the note is genuine. The note was written by Nietzsche in his private notebooks at this time in 1888. And so it is important, I would say. And this is the note, and this contains maybe the clearest argument for eternal return. He says, if the world may be thought of as a certain definite quantity of force and as a certain definite number of centers of force, and every other representation remains indefinite and therefore useless, it follows that in the great dice game of existence, it must pass through a calculable number of combinations. In infinite time, every possible combination would at some time or another be realized. More, it would be realized an infinite number of times. And since between every combination and its next recurrence, all other possible combinations would have to take place, and each of these combinations conditions the entire sequence of combinations in the same series, a circular movement of absolutely identical series is thus demonstrated. The world as a circular movement that has already repeated itself infinitely often and plays its game ad infinitum. End quote. And so this is a little bit, it's a lot in a small space. It's a lot of argument and a lot of text in a small space. So we'll unpack it later into sort of a more structured argument. But it shows that at the very end of his sane life, he was thinking about this very seriously and thinking about this as a scientific theory, as a cosmological theory. Now, those are sort of the evidence from his notebooks that he took it this way. There are a few other facts suggesting that Nietzsche intended eternal return literally. So for a start, there's his own intense emotional response to it. So he seems to have taken it incredibly seriously, sort of from a personal, emotional point of view, one that would seem to go beyond just thinking about it as a thought experiment to motivate you to live more fully or more sincerely or what have you. So this is a quote from Lou Salome. Lou Salome famously was a woman that Nietzsche was closely associated with and essentially in love with, although he didn't manage to win her. And so obviously, they had this personal dynamic, and so maybe she isn't the most trustworthy source, but she's a good source anyway. She's a useful source from being so close to Nietzsche and being someone that Nietzsche would presumably confide these things in and actually open himself up to in a way that probably he wouldn't have been willing to do to many other people. And so she wrote a book about Nietzsche later on. And so this is from her book. And this is what she says in reference to this idea of the eternal return. She says, quote, "Indeed, Nietzsche even then carried around with him an inescapable fate that wished to, quote, change and crush him." Change and crush, her quotes. He rested up courage in order to confess its invincible truth and far-reaching implications for himself and others. Unforgettable for me are those hours in which he first confided to me his secret, whose inevitable fulfillment and validation he anticipated with shudders. Only with a quiet voice and with all the signs of deepest horror did he speak about this secret. The secret, of course, or end quote, but the secret, of course, being this idea of the eternal return. So that doesn't sound like, assuming that her story is accurate, and we're going to see a quote in a minute that kind of speaks to Nietzsche's, let's say, emotional volatility at the time, which maybe lends some credence to this account. But let's say we take this account seriously. It does suggest that this was something more than just a thought experiment, that he actually believed that this was real, that this would actually happen, that he would live his life again and again infinitely, and that everyone does this, and that the whole of history would recur again and again. And you can imagine that if you actually believe that, that will, take an emotional toll on you, and you will not sort of take that lightly and speak about that lightly. Okay, so let me just find my place here. Okay, so this is a letter to his friend Peter Gast, and on the 14th of August 1881. I found this on Wikisource. So if you go to Wikisource, selected letters of Friedrich Nietzsche, that should be in there somewhere. So you can sort of see it in context. But this is something that he wrote to his friend, and again, it speaks to his emotional volatility at the time. It speaks to the intensity of what was going on for him upon the discovery or around the discovery of the eternal return. So he says, quote, "Thoughts have loomed upon my horizon the like of which I have not known before. I shall not divulge anything about them, but shall remain imperturbably calm." End quote, just for a second, for an interjection. So that already kind of speaks to the veracity of Lou Salame's account of him sort of treating this as a deep secret, as something incredibly profound that one shouldn't take lightly, or that he was keeping to himself for a certain time. Okay, I'll continue the quote. "I shall have to live a few years longer. Ah, my friend, sometimes I have a feeling that I am leading a most dangerous life, for I belong to the kind of machine that can fly to pieces. The intensity of my feelings makes me shudder and laugh. Once or twice already I have been unable to leave my room for the absurd reason that my eyes were inflamed. By what? On each occasion I had wept too much on my wanderings the day before, and not sentimental tears by any means, but tears of joy and exultation. At such moments I sang and uttered nonsense, filled with a new vision which I had seen in advance of the rest of mankind." End quote. So, contemplating the eternal return maybe brings a sense of dread and terror for what has happened in one's life or for what has happened in history. It may also bring exaltation, as Nietzsche mentions in that famous passage from The Gay Science, where the demon puts this to you as a thought experiment. Interestingly, just looking through Salame's kind of biography or analysis of Nietzsche, she emphasizes the dread, the dread and the anxiety. But Nietzsche, in his letter to Peter Gast, is sort of emphasizing that he's weeping from exaltation, he's weeping from joy. And probably there was a bit of both, I would say. It is a heavy weight. It is something that could crush one. But at the same time, Nietzsche's glimpsing a way that maybe he's not able to do it yet. He does say, "I shall have to live a few years longer." Maybe he's not able to do it yet, but he sees a way to fully affirm life and to fully affirm the world as it is. And that's his mission, right? He doesn't want to be kind of the Schopenhauerian pessimist. He wants to see the world exactly as it is and be able to affirm it. And he's kind of glimpsed a way that he can maybe put himself in the mindset where he's able to do that. And that humanity in general might be able to put itself in a mindset where it's able to do that without resting on kind of transcendent ideals or ideas, transcendent hopes of salvation or something like that. So in any case, it is an extremely emotional time for him. So regardless of whether this is a manifestation of the same mental instability that would ultimately destroy him, as it would in 1889 when he broke down, from which he never recovered, but regardless of whether this is a manifestation of that, and it may very well be, it does show what an impact these thoughts had on him. And these lines to his friend are echoed in his autobiography, in Ecce Homo, where he discusses how the book Zarathustra came to him, or as he puts it, waylaid him on his walks. So here's the quote from Ecce Homo. This is a fascinating quote, and it's a fascinating passage in this book as well. The part that deals with inspiration and his experience of inspiration. So Nietzsche says, has anyone at the end of the 19th century a clear idea of what poets of strong ages have called inspiration? If not, I will describe it. If one had the slightest residue of superstition left in one's system, one could hardly reject altogether the idea that one is merely incarnation, merely mouthpiece, merely a medium of overpowering forces. The concept of revelation, in the sense that suddenly, with indescribable certainty and subtlety, something becomes visible, audible, something that shakes one to the last depths and throws one down, that merely describes the facts. One hears, one does not seek. One accepts, one does not ask who gives. Like lightning, a thought flashes up, with necessity, without hesitation regarding its form. I never had any choice. Everything happens involuntarily in the highest degree, but as in a gale of feeling of freedom, of absoluteness, of power, of divinity. And so, end quote. So this is Nietzsche's account of inspiration. And this way of experiencing his insights would have infused them with a great sense of certainty and importance. By their very nature, they would seem to disclose a deeper aspect of existence. Just if you were having insights, if you were having kind of profound philosophical thoughts of this forcefulness, of this kind of almost physical impact and intensity, you would just naturally think that, well, maybe you would think that you're going insane. But if you didn't think that, or you didn't think that was the primary explanation, you would think that you would just naturally think that they were true, that these were truths that were dawning on you. By their very nature, they would seem to disclose a deeper aspect of existence. In light of this, it's highly likely that Nietzsche would have at least felt the eternal return to be something far more than a mere thought experiment to prompt one to live better. Indeed, it seems that taking it as only a thought experiment undermines the very reaction it's intended to produce. If I know it's not true, how can it weigh on me as the greatest weight? Why affirm the whole of my life as if it were to recur eternally if I know it will occur once and be gone? It may make my unconscious relation to life clearer, like how I'm actually living right now, like how I'm seeing life, how I'm reacting to life. So going through that thought experiment could make these things clear to me, and then I can work with them and change them if I want to. But it probably could not prompt me to an absolute repulsion or affirmation, right? If it was just a thought experiment and I knew it was just a thought experiment, could it really prompt me to that level of affirmation or repulsion that's necessary and that Nietzsche seems to be evoking here? In any case, the hypothetical life of the eternal return and the actual life it's supposed to improve are quite different things. Affirming the one isn't necessarily affirming the other, and what's good for the one isn't necessarily good for the other. So what I mean by that is to affirm my transient life is to affirm its very transience. It passes away forever. The good and bad events it contains are annihilated, making approaches like, let's say, letting go or replacing potentially more relevant than affirming and integrating. So if life is actually inherently transient, like actually will pass away forever and never return or never eternal in any way, and I'm wanting to affirm life as it is, just as it is, it seems that the eternal return doesn't quite hit the mark, because it doesn't let me affirm its very transience as such. Maybe it comes close. Maybe it comes closer than sort of notions of an eternal afterlife, of a different life. But it doesn't go all the way. And if I was to affirm the very transience of my life, I wouldn't be affirming eternal return. I wouldn't be affirming eternality of life. And so there'd be a different life and it would have different results. So like I mentioned, maybe the approach of just letting things go and not holding on to them would be the more apt approach to a life that was truly transient. Because why torment myself over things that will never return, or potentially a slightly different approach, or a largely different approach maybe, replacing things. So if I lose something that's of value to me, I then have to look at replacing it. There's no comfort in knowing that it's eternal. There's no comfort in knowing that my life will recur, and so I'll have it again. But maybe I want something instead of it. I can't get it back, so I want something else. Maybe this kind of, instead of letting go, it's kind of grasping, a reaching out, a getting more, or getting different things for as long as I can. These are just two examples. Maybe there are other ways that you could deal with a transient life if it was truly transient. But what I'm saying is that the ideal of affirming life fully and integrating life fully are not necessarily the case. Just one other example in terms of integrating: if I do something bad, or if something terrible happens to me in the past, but life isn't eternal in any way and it will never recur, why do I have to integrate it, right? I don't have to integrate it. I can just forget about it. I can just let it go. But maybe we don't want to let it go. Maybe we want to. Maybe there's some value in integrating it, right? But that only really fully makes sense within the frame of an eternalized life, or an eternalist life. And so that's that point there. So it seems that Nietzsche kind of attended eternal return merely as a helpful thought experiment, though reluctant to put it forward as a serious theory in his published work. It may be that he was biding his time, waiting to see if the idea he received with the force of a revelation could be demonstrated by the most rigorous science. So there's another little interesting anecdote by Lou Salome, where she mentions that shortly after the idea occurred to him, he considered devoting 10 years to the study of physics in order to confirm or refute it. Now, this was a plan he thankfully abandoned, given the philosophical masterpieces he produced in that time, where he would have been studying physics. So it's a boon for us that he let that idea go. But if that's true, if Salome's account is true, that he actually thought about this, that's really interesting, Maybe it also speaks to the phrase, I'll have to live a few more years, in his letter to Peter Gast that we just saw. I'll have to live a few more years to see if this is actually true, or to prove it, to see if I can actually prove this. And then finally, let's look at what we've already looked at before, but in the form of just a slightly more structured argument. So this is from The Will to Power, aphorism 1066, that we've already seen, but I've sort of broken it down into the premises and the conclusion. We could take this as being pretty much the final form of the argument as Nietzsche intended it, remembering that this was written in 1888 in his notebooks. And so the first premise is simply that if the universe is composed of a definite quantity of force and of centers of force, so think maybe particles there, something very like particles, it must pass through a calculable, i.e. finite, number of combinations. So there must be a finite number of combinations if there's a definite quantity of force and of force centers. The second premise: in infinite time, every possible combination must be realized an infinite number of times. And so that's kind of intuitive-ish to understand, because given an infinite number of times, as long as there's not complete stasis at any point, then eventually everything should recur. Premise 3, each combination fully determines the next combination. So this is sort of the determinist premise. Every state is completely determined by the prior state. So just pure hardcore determinism there. And this was popular in the day. And premise 4, the universe is composed of a definite quantity of... So, premise 4, the universe is composed of a definite quantity of force and centers of force. So, premise 1 now becomes relevant. Premise 5, time is infinite. So premise 2 now becomes relevant. And if you put that all together, the universe goes through the exact same series of combinations an infinite number of times, because each combination leads to the next combination inexorably, right? and eventually a combination will repeat. And if a combination repeats, right, if there's another instance of the same combination at any point in time, then all the other combinations that flow from it must also repeat until we reach the same combination. And so you get this loop, and time loops onto itself, or something like that. And so that's the argument. Now, people who write about Nietzsche and the eternal return, they're often very dismissive of, especially those who see it primarily as being a thought experiment, they're often very dismissive of this argument that Nietzsche makes, as though it wasn't plausible, it couldn't have been scientifically plausible even at the time. Not everyone writes like this, but I think that's a common thing, and partly that's to do with what's happened after in terms of science, in terms of physics, which I'm going to go into, which does render it highly unlikely or practically impossible. But at the time, this was a very different thing. And so if you grant that time is infinite, if you grant that the universe is composed of definite quantity of force and centers of force, if you grant, complete determinism in its evolution, it does seem like this would follow. People have kind of questioned or criticized the first premise, because especially if space is ultimately infinitely divisible, let's say, that doesn't quite work out. But if it were not infinitely divisible, if we actually did definitely have a finite number of locations that a particle, a center of force, could occupy, then it would be different. Now, on that note, I want to talk briefly about Henri Poincaré and his recurrence theorem. So ironically, less than 3 weeks after Nietzsche's final collapse, so within 3 weeks of Nietzsche's final breakdown, from which he never recovered, the physicist Henri Poincaré revealed his recurrence theorem, demonstrating that given sufficient time, certain dynamical systems will return to a state arbitrarily close to their initial state. If the entire universe were such a system and time were infinite, its states would recur an infinite number of times. And at this point, I'll just mention there's a great book by Nielsen Hababu called Nietzsche on the Eternal Recurrence, which points out the similarity between Nietzsche's theory and Poincaré's theorem, and it's thanks to this book that I first noticed this. Now, we're not going to go into all the details of this, but we're just going to talk about what's important. So, first of all, it's quite striking that this is very, very close to what Nietzsche is saying. It's a more exact demonstration of what Nietzsche is sketching out in this note in an argument, but in a slightly looser way, right? But Poincaré is sort of demonstrating it scientifically, mathematically, that this would be the case. But there's a problem. So it doesn't. So, well, first of all, we should acknowledge that suggests that Nietzsche wasn't just wildly speculating in a way that was simply ungrounded from the physics of his time. It's not like that at all. He was actually quite aware of the physics of his time, not in a deeply specialist sense, but he was reading quite a lot of physics of the time, and sort of speculation about different physical theories and so forth, and what the universe was like from a scientific point of view. So he was quite engaged with that, and so he was aware of all this, and so Poincaré's recurrence theorem, I think, shows that he was onto something. And it is an ironic twist that it was so close after his collapse that came about. But it doesn't fully save him. It doesn't fully save him, because Poincaré's recurrence is not an absolutely precise recurrence, So if we take space as being infinitely divisible, right? So there's not like a smallest possible length that something could ever be. In the case of particles arranged in space, we can only say that they return arbitrarily close to their original position. So that means we can define whatever area we like, of whatever size, and a particle will return to that area given a long enough time frame. But for it to return to exactly the same position, right? So not no variation in position whatsoever, even like just precisely the same. That is infinitely unlikely if space is infinitely divisible. And you can see why. Because there'll always be some space which it could yet occupy to fully align with where it was previously. And so what we say in Poincaré's recurrence theorem is that they will return to an arbitrarily close. They will return to an arbitrarily close position. And practically, that may not make a difference, but it also may make a difference. So, for instance, does it matter if the particles that make up the future version of me at this moment, so me sitting here creating this video, if the particles that make me up in the future version of me happen to be offset by a billionth of a nanometer, does it matter? Probably not, because to all intents and purposes, it's going to be the same being, and if physical structure is the same, and that means that, like, let's presume that if physical structure is almost the same, then I'll have the same thoughts, I'll have the same experience, I'll have the same consciousness, I'll do the same things. So it doesn't seem like it would be a problem. But then where is the limit? Like, where is the magical point at which it becomes me and beyond which it's not me? And this leads to a bigger problem, because this compounds. If this minuscule offset affects anything at all, right? So if it has any effect on my behavior, on my action, on my interaction with the world, any effect at all, then it could evolve over time into a vastly different sequence of events. So if something now is just very slightly different, then it could have knock-on effects that make things a million years in the future vastly different. So while Poincaré's theorem guarantees the eventual return of similar states, it does not guarantee the return of identical sequences, which is what Nietzsche's argument requires, basically. So that's pretty much the end of my video. It was, maybe it could have been more concise, but I wanted to sort of talk through this for anyone who's sort of interested in the question. And the article that I wrote is obviously very compressed, and essentially, I just tried to squash what I've said into 2 paragraphs just to give some context going forward. I will make more of these videos, at least a couple more, probably just a couple more, try to make them a little bit more concise. But the next video I'll probably will probably be dealing with the theory of relativity, which was really fascinating for me to explore and sort of get my mind around and kind of have it finally click conceptually for me, so I understood it. And so I want to sort of replicate that, so I'll probably use some videos that I used in learning it and so forth. Where this is all leading is, like I said, that relativity gives us a way to understand Nietzsche's eternal return that is fully compatible, at least with relativity, which is a large part of physics today. And so it makes it extremely relevant and kind of forces it itself on us as, the universe could actually be like this. Not something that eternally recurs, but something which is already existing in every time. Future, past, what we call future and past, all of it just exists in one great block. Now, for this video here, just to make the conclusions crystal clear, it is interesting that Nietzsche kind of tries to disguise the eternal return as a cosmological theory in his published works. He does seem to create some distance, to want to create some distance with it. And I think that's partly because he is mainly concerned about the orientation one has towards life. You know, there's also a lot of kind of skepticism, perspectivism in Nietzsche, which begs the question of how committed he was to this as being the model which reality conforms to, as opposed to just a model. But on the other hand, it does seem that he took it incredibly seriously, and in a way that actually emotionally affected him, and deeply affected him. And that maybe he saw as a kind of, or at least maybe saw is too strong a word, but maybe he felt it as a revelation. And to feel something as a revelation is not insignificant, even if consciously you say, well, there's no such thing as revelation. Because it determines the way that you unconsciously take it or believe in it or adhere to it, which isn't just a matter of conscious proposition, but which is sort of like something much deeper than that. And so I think that, you know, on the one hand, he did see that it meshed well with science as it was understood at the time. And I think that he had that emotional impact from it as sort of occurring to him or forcing itself on him as a revelation. And I think that was what was kind of driving him when he was thinking about it, when he described himself as being the teacher of the eternal return, as being sort of this as being almost definitional of what he was doing, of his elevation of this idea in Zarathustra, and also the important role it plays in gay science and in Beyond Good and Evil, even though it's not talked about throughout these books, even though it sort of just appears, one gets the sense that everything is oriented around it in a way. And so I would say that maybe what Nietzsche was doing is he was waiting, he was biding his time until it became more clear as a scientific theory that it actually was you know, the best that science could offer as an explanation or a description of the universe, before sort of just putting it forward boldly as being scientific truth. And I also think that he didn't need it. He didn't need it to be scientific, just be completely scientifically established in order to run with it, because again, his project is largely existential, like how do you live, and that's the vital thing. Now, affirming the world as it is, being able to affirm the world as it is, that was seemed to have already been a preoccupation of his. And so this was a way that one could potentially do it, at least. And so that's what I think about that. And in terms of, you know, having said all that, current physics doesn't allow for it. So I think that he did believe in it, but we can't believe in it in the same way that he believed in it. And yet, in this funny way, it comes back again, right? It returns in this different guise, in this eternalist guise, in this guise of relativity. And that's what I'm going to focus on next.